The Galactic Council chamber was massive and filled with strange lights that danced across walls made of materials humans had never seen before, and Commander Kyle Harrison stood in the center of it all wearing his crisp navy blue uniform while 47 different alien species watched him from their seats high above. He looked calm, but inside his heart was beating fast because he knew what was about to happen. And he had been preparing for this moment for 3 years since he first received the secret briefings from Earth Command. The chamber smelled like ozone and something sweet that Kyle could never quite identify, and the air felt heavy with anticipation as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath waiting for what came next. The Velcrin ambassador rose from his seat, and Kyle had to tilt his head back to see the creature properly, because the Velcrin were tall, and their bodies were made of something that looked like living crystal that caught the light and threw rainbows across the floor. The ambassador's voice came through the translation device in Kyle's ear, and it sounded deep and resonant like thunder rolling across distant mountains. The Velcrin began speaking about the ancient truce that was signed back in the year 2156, when humanity first made contact with alien life and nearly got wiped out in the process, because humans back then had been so primitive and weak compared to the rest of the galaxy. Kyle remembered his history lessons about first contact and how humanity had been exploring their own solar system, when the Velcrin ships appeared and demonstrated weapons that could crack planets in half, and Earth's leaders had no choice but to accept protection under what the aliens called a truce, but what was really more like a leash that kept humanity from expanding too far or growing too strong. The Velcrin ambassador continued talking, and his words were harsh as he listed all the crimes that humanity had supposedly committed over the past few decades, like establishing colonies in restricted zones and mining asteroids that belonged to other species and sending research ships into areas of space that were supposed to be forbidden to humans. Around the chamber, other aliens made sounds of agreement, and Kyle could hear chirping from the Thessian delegates who looked like giant birds and growling from the Corthan, who were covered in thick fur, and strange harmonics from the Melodians, who communicated through sound waves that made Kyle's bones vibrate. The Velcrin ambassador raised one crystalline arm and the chamber fell silent, and then he spoke the words that would change everything. He declared that the truce was over, and that humanity had 30 standard cycles, which was about 42 Earth days to surrender all military assets and submit to the authority of the Galactic Alliance or face complete subjugation. The word subjugation hung in the air like a threat, and Kyle knew what it meant because he had studied the history of other species who had been subjugated, and it meant slavery, and it meant humanity would lose all freedom and all hope of ever being anything more than servants to alien masters. The chamber erupted in sounds of approval, and Kyle stood there taking it all in and waiting for his moment to speak, because he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in simulations, and he knew exactly what he needed to say. Back on Earth deep, beneath the Rocky Mountains in a command center that had been built over centuries, Admiral Patricia Morgan watched the proceedings on holographic screens that showed Kyle standing alone in that alien chamber, and she felt proud of him, because he looked strong and unafraid. Patricia was 73 years old, and she had spent her entire life preparing for this day ever since she was a young lieutenant, learning about the secret programs that humanity had been running since the truce began. She turned to Captain Derek Hayes, who stood beside her with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on the screens. Patricia's voice was quiet but firm as she gave the order to begin Phase 1, and Derek nodded and moved to his console, where he began sending encrypted signals to military installations across the solar system and beyond, to places that the aliens didn't know existed because humanity had been very, very good at keeping secrets for 2,000 years. Patricia thought about all the generations of humans who had worked in secret building ships and weapons and defensive systems, while the aliens thought humanity was weak and grateful for protection. Back in the council chamber, the noise finally died down and Kyle cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the vast space because he had been trained in public speaking, and he knew how to project confidence even when facing overwhelming odds. He thanked the Velcrin ambassador for the warning, and his tone was polite, but there was something in his voice that made several aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats. Kyle said that he appreciated the clarity of the situation, but that the Velcrin and the Galactic Alliance had made a terrible miscalculation. The Velcrin ambassador's crystalline features seemed to darken, and his voice dripped with contempt as he asked if Kyle had forgotten how easily the aliens could have destroyed humanity 2,000 years ago, when humans were barely capable of leaving their own planet. The ambassador reminded Kyle that humanity had survived only because the Galactic Alliance had shown mercy and offered protection, and now humanity dared to speak of miscalculations as if they had any power at all in the grand scheme of galactic politics. Kyle let the ambassador finish, and then he smiled. And it was not a nervous smile or a frightened smile, but the kind of smile that comes from knowing something that nobody else knows. And it was the kind of smile that made the Velcrin ambassador pause, because there was confidence in that smile that shouldn't have been there. Kyle spoke again, and his words were measured and calm as he said that the aliens were right about one thing, which was that humanity had nearly been destroyed at first contact. But what the aliens seemed to have forgotten was what humanity had been doing for the past 2,000 years while the truce was in effect. The Velcrin ambassador demanded to know what Kyle meant, and Kyle's smile widened just a little bit more as he explained that the aliens had assumed the truce was about protection and about keeping humanity safe from the dangers of the galaxy, but that humanity had understood the truce very differently. Kyle said that humanity had seen the truce as an opportunity and as a gift of time that allowed them to learn and grow and prepare for the day when the protection would end and humanity would have to stand on its own. The chamber grew quieter, and some of the alien delegates leaned forward in their seats because something in Kyle's tone suggested that he knew more than he should, and that humanity might not be as helpless as the Galactic Alliance had assumed. Kyle continued speaking, and he told them that every technology the aliens had shared, thinking humanity was too primitive to truly understand, it had been studied and improved and incorporated into systems that the galaxy had never imagined. He said that every star chart and every piece of information about alien military capabilities had been analyzed, and that humanity had spent 2,000 years learning the weaknesses of every species in the Galactic Alliance. The Velcrin ambassador interrupted and demanded to know what Kyle was suggesting, and Kyle stopped smiling and his face became serious as he looked up at the towering crystal being and said simply that humanity was ready and that the Galactic Alliance was about to discover what 2,000 years of preparation looked like. The chamber erupted in chaos with aliens shouting and demanding explanations, but Kyle just stood there calm and composed because he knew that back on Earth and Mars and dozens of hidden bases throughout the solar system and beyond Admiral Patricia, Morgan and thousands of other humans were already moving into position, and the real demonstration of human capability was about to begin. Lieutenant Amy Cooper sat in the pilot's seat of a ship called Whisper, and her fingers moved across holographic controls that glowed softly in the darkness of space, while she watched the Velcrin fleet moving into position exactly as the computer models had predicted they would. Beside her sat her husband, Lieutenant Greg Foster, who was studying tactical readouts on his own screen, and occasionally he would whistle softly through his teeth when he saw something interesting in the data. The Whisper was a stealth reconnaissance ship that the aliens didn't know existed because it used technology that bent light around the hull, making it invisible to their sensors, and Amy had been flying missions like this for 5 years, gathering intelligence on alien fleet movements and military capabilities. Greg looked over at his wife and commented that the Velcrin were positioning themselves in 12 battle groups, using the standard diamond formation that they always used, because the Velcrin were powerful, but they were also predictable, and they had been using the same tactics for thousands of years. Amy nodded, and her fingers were already typing out an encrypted message that would bounce through relay stations hidden in asteroids and on the dark sides of moons, before finally reaching Earth Command, deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. The message was simple, and it confirmed that the Velcrin fleet was approaching Earth's outer defensive perimeter, and that they had no idea what was waiting for them. What the Velcrin didn't know, and what none of the 47 alien species in the Galactic Alliance knew, was that humanity had spent every single day of the past 2,000 years preparing for exactly this moment, and the truce hadn't been a period of peaceful coexistence, but rather it had been humanity's longest military preparation in all of history. Amy thought about her great-great-grandmother, who had been one of the first pilots trained in the secret space program, back when humanity was still pretending to struggle with basic spaceflight, and she felt connected to all those generations of humans who had worked in secret building and planning and waiting for the day when Earth would have to stand alone. On Mars, in facilities that had been carved out beneath the red planet's surface over the course of 500 years, General Nathan Price walked through massive hangars that stretched for miles underground, and the ceiling was so high that clouds actually formed near the top from the temperature differences. All around him were ships, and not the simple vessels that humanity showed to the aliens, but sleek warships that incorporated technologies the galaxy believed humans couldn't possibly possess. Each ship was a masterpiece of engineering with weapons that could punch through alien shields and engines that could outmaneuver anything the Velcrin had ever built. Nathan's boots echoed on the metal floor as he walked, and behind him followed Major Lisa Grant, who carried a datapad and was reading off status reports in a calm, professional voice. She told him that all 847 vessels of the Mars fleet were fully operational, and that every crew member was at their station waiting for the order to launch. Nathan nodded and allowed himself a rare smile because he had been working toward this moment for 30 years, ever since he was a young captain, learning about the true extent of humanity's secret military buildup. The aliens thought humanity had 12 capital ships and maybe 50 cruisers and perhaps 200 smaller vessels scattered across a few star systems. But they had no idea about the thousands of ships that humanity had been building in secret for centuries. The ships were hidden everywhere in hollowed-out asteroids that looked like nothing special, and beneath the surfaces of moons that appeared uninhabited, and in the cold darkness of the Kuiper Belt where no alien patrol ever ventured, because they thought nothing of value existed out there. Nathan thought about how the aliens had been so arrogant and so sure of their superiority that they never bothered to look closely at what humanity was really doing. Back on Earth, in a building that looked like an ordinary office complex in Seattle, Dr. Helen Mitchell sat in front of screens that displayed data so advanced that even most humans wouldn't understand what they were seeing. Helen had gray hair and tired eyes, but her mind was as sharp as it had been 40 years ago when she first joined the secret research division that was working on faster-than-light communication. The aliens used a relay network that was slow and outdated, but they controlled it completely, and they made humanity pay expensive fees to use it, which meant every human message could be monitored and intercepted. But Helen and her team had cracked the problem of faster-than-light communication 300 years ago, and humanity had kept it secret all this time, allowing the aliens to believe that humans were still dependent on their inferior technology. Now Helen watched as real-time feeds came in from every human position across the galaxy, and there were hundreds of colonies and thousands of outposts and secret military stations that the aliens knew nothing about. One of Helen's young assistants called out excitedly that all stations were reporting full readiness, and that every human position from the closest moon base to the most distant colony was synchronized and waiting for Admiral Morgan's command. Helen felt a surge of pride because this network represented the work of so many brilliant humans across so many generations, and it was the key to everything, because with instant communication across light years, humanity could coordinate attacks and defenses in ways that the aliens couldn't match. She thought about the Velcrin fleet moving toward Earth, completely unaware that every move they made was being watched and analyzed and reported instantly to command centers across human space. Lieutenant Amy Cooper received a new set of orders through her neural interface, and she blinked twice to acknowledge the message while her hands never stopped moving across the controls. Greg looked at her and asked what the orders were, and Amy told him they were to fall back to Rally Point 7 and prepare to document the opening engagement. Greg understood what that meant, and it meant that Earth was about to show the Velcrin exactly what humanity had been building for 2,000 years. The Whisper's engines came to life silently because they were designed to produce no emissions that alien sensors could detect, and Amy guided the ship away from the Velcrin fleet toward a position where they would have a perfect view of everything that was about to happen. She thought about her children back on Earth Station 3, who were safe in the underground shelters that had been built precisely for this eventuality, and she felt grateful that her kids would grow up in a galaxy where humanity no longer had to bow to alien authority. On Mars, General Nathan Price received the alert he had been waiting for, and he turned to Major Lisa Grant and gave the order to begin pre-launch sequences. All around him, alarms began to sound, and thousands of crew members rushed to their ships, and the massive hangar doors began to open, revealing the Martian sky above. Nathan walked to the observation deck and watched as the first ships began to lift off their landing pads, and soon the sky was filled with human warships rising from beneath the surface like a swarm of metal predators. Back on Earth, Admiral Patricia. Morgan watched multiple screens showing different aspects of the unfolding situation, and she saw Kyle Harrison still standing in the alien council chamber where chaos had erupted after his declaration, and she saw the Velcrin fleet approaching the outer defensive perimeter, and she saw the Mars fleet beginning its launch sequence. Captain Derek Hayes stood beside her and asked if she wanted to activate the defensive grid, and Patricia nodded because the time for hiding was over, and the time for revelation had begun. Across the solar system, what the aliens had thought were simple communication satellites and harmless research stations suddenly came online and revealed themselves to be weapon platforms and shield generators and sensor arrays that had been disguised for centuries. The defensive grid that humanity had been building since the truce began flickered into existence, and it was like a web of energy that covered the entire solar system, turning it into a fortress that would be nearly impossible to breach. Every asteroid and every moon and every planet had been incorporated into this defensive network, and the aliens were about to discover that attacking Earth was not going to be the simple conquest they had imagined. The Velcrin battle fleet emerged from hyperspace. At the edge of Earth's solar system, and Commander Zekthorn stood on the bridge of his flagship, expecting to see humanity's pathetic defenses scrambling in panic, but instead he saw something that made his crystalline body go cold with confusion. His tactical officer was a younger Velcrin named Shalven, and he was working frantically at his console, making sounds of distress that Zekthorn had never heard from him before. Shalven reported that he was detecting thousands of energy signatures coming from everywhere, and they were appearing in the asteroid belt and around Jupiter's moons and even in the distant Kuiper belt, as if the entire solar system had been turned into a weapon. Zekthorn studied his own displays and couldn't believe what he was seeing because their intelligence reports had shown that humanity had minimal defenses and that Earth would fall within days of the attack beginning. But now his sensors were lighting up with contacts that shouldn't exist. He ordered his weapons officer to fire on the nearest platform, which was orbiting Mars, because he needed to show his crew that human defenses were nothing to fear and that their weapons were superior to anything humanity could build. The flagship's primary weapon charged up, and it was a beam cannon, capable of cracking a planet's crust, and it had destroyed entire fleets in previous wars, and Zekthorn felt confident that it would vaporize whatever pathetic shield the humans had erected. The beam lanced across the darkness of space, traveling at nearly the speed of light, and it struck the orbital platform with the force of a small star, and for a moment Zekthorn thought the platform would be destroyed, but then something impossible happened. The platform's shields activated, and they absorbed the blast with barely a flicker, and the energy readings showed that the shields were still at 98% capacity after taking a direct hit from the most powerful weapon in the Velcrin arsenal. Shalven reported the shield strength with a trembling voice, and Zekthorn felt something he hadn't felt in centuries, which was fear. On Mars, in the command center, Major Lisa Grant watched the attack on her displays and reported to General Nathan Price that their shields had held and were operating at optimal efficiency. Nathan nodded and told her not to return fire yet, because he wanted the Velcrin to waste their ammunition and to begin understanding what they were truly facing. All around the command center, human officers worked calmly at their stations, and there was no panic and no fear, because they had trained for this scenario thousands of times in simulations, and they knew that Earth's defenses were far superior to anything the aliens possessed. The Velcrin fleet launched its second wave, and this time they deployed fighter squadrons, numbering in the thousands, because Zekthorn believed that overwhelming numbers would succeed where raw firepower had failed. The alien fighters streaked toward Earth like a swarm of angry insects, and their pilots were confident because they had fought countless battles and had never been defeated by any species in the galaxy. But then human interceptors began emerging from hidden bays throughout the solar system, and these ships moved with a precision and grace that should have been impossible because they were controlled not just by pilots but by neural interfaces that connected human minds directly to the ship's systems. Lieutenant Jake Morris sat in the cockpit of his fighter, and he didn't need to use his hands to control the ship because his thoughts were transmitted directly to the navigation and weapon systems through the implant at the base of his skull. The neural interface had been developed 400 years ago, but the aliens had declared such technology illegal, claiming it was unethical and dangerous, but humanity had continued developing it in secret, and now Jake and thousands of other Human pilots had an advantage that no alien pilot could match. Jake thought about diving left, and his ship responded instantly, banking through space in a maneuver that would have taken precious seconds if he had been using manual controls. Around him, hundreds of other human pilots were doing the same thing, and they moved like a school of fish, all connected through the neural network that allowed them to coordinate without speaking and to anticipate each other's movements with perfect precision. The alien fighters didn't stand a chance because they were controlled by pilots using traditional interfaces, and by the time they realized what was happening, half their squadron had been destroyed. Jake transmitted a message requesting permission to advance, and the response came back immediately telling him to show the aliens what humanity could do. Back on Earth, Admiral Patricia Morgan coordinated with human forces across the entire galaxy, using the faster-than-light communication network that Dr. Helen Mitchell had developed, and what the aliens didn't know was that while they were attacking Earth, human forces were simultaneously striking back at alien positions light years away. Captain Derek Hayes stood beside Patricia, studying a tactical display that showed not just the battle for Earth, but dozens of engagements happening across human space, all moving in perfect synchronization. Derek reported that the aliens were in complete disarray because they had never expected coordinated resistance on this scale. Patricia allowed herself a small smile, and she thought about all the years of planning and preparation and sacrifice that had gone into this moment, and she knew that the aliens had made a fatal mistake when they assumed the truce was about mercy. The truth was that the truce had been about preparation, and humanity had used every single day of those 2,000 years to learn and build and grow stronger, while the aliens had become complacent and arrogant. She watched as the Velcrin fleet tried to regroup, and she could see the confusion in their movements because nothing was going according to their battle plans. Commander Zekthorn finally understood the trap he had flown into, and he realized that the humans hadn't been idle during the 2,000-year truce, but had instead been studying every aspect of Velcrin, military doctrine and technology. Every piece of technology the aliens had shared, believing humanity was too primitive to truly understand it, had been analyzed and improved and turned into weapons and defenses that the galaxy had never imagined possible. Zekthorn's pride had blinded him, and now his fleet was being torn apart by an enemy he had underestimated completely. He gave the order to retreat, and his communications officer immediately began transmitting distress signals to the Galactic Alliance, requesting reinforcements because Zekthorn knew that his fleet alone could not defeat Earth's defenses. But General Nathan Price had anticipated this move, and as the Velcrin ships tried to disengage, the Mars fleet launched from its hidden base, and 847 warships emerged from beneath the red planet's surface. The human fleet moved to cut off the Velcrin's escape route, and suddenly the aliens found themselves trapped between Earth's orbital defenses behind them and an overwhelming force of fresh human ships ahead of them. Lieutenant Amy Cooper and her husband Greg watched the battle unfold from their position in the Whisper, and they could see the moment when the Velcrin fleet realized they were trapped. Greg asked quietly if they should feel sorry for the aliens, and Amy thought about the ultimatum the Velcrin had delivered, threatening complete subjugation and the arrogant assumption that humanity would simply surrender without a fight. She told Greg that the aliens had 2,000 years to learn who humanity really was, and they had chosen not to pay attention because they were too busy believing their own superiority. In the alien council chamber, where Kyle Harrison had stood alone facing the assembled ambassadors of 47 species, chaos now reigned, and the aliens who had so confidently declared war on humanity were watching in horror as their forces were systematically dismantled. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy telling of human ships appearing where intelligence said there should be none, and human weapons proving far more advanced than anyone had suspected, and human colonies fighting back with unexpected ferocity. The Velcrin ambassador, whose crystalline form had seemed so imposing earlier, now appeared dim and faded as he watched his fleet's destruction on the holographic displays. Truth was becoming impossible to deny, and even the most arrogant species in the council had to admit that they had been deceived on a scale that was almost unimaginable. Humanity hadn't spent 2,000 years cowering under the protection of a truce, but had instead spent that time preparing for war and learning from their enemies and studying every alien species in the Alliance to identify weaknesses and develop counters. Every spy the aliens had sent to human worlds had been carefully managed and fed false information, and every diplomatic exchange had been an opportunity for humanity to learn while revealing nothing of their true capabilities. The battle for Earth's solar system raged for 3 days, and during that time the true scope of humanity's preparations became clear to every species in the Galactic Alliance, and what they had believed was a weak species barely capable of defending itself turned out to be something far more dangerous and far more capable than anyone had imagined. In the Outer Rim territories where human colonies existed, the aliens had always thought these settlements were simple farming communities or mining operations staffed by civilians who would surrender immediately when faced with military force. But Commander Sarah Wells stood on the bridge of her command center, watching alien warships approach her world, and she smiled, because these aliens had no idea what was waiting for them. Sarah had been the colony commander for 12 years, and during that time she had overseen the secret militarization of what appeared to be an ordinary agricultural settlement, and beneath the fields of wheat and corn were massive weapons systems that could emerge at a moment's notice. The colonists had all been evacuated to underground shelters weeks ago, because humanity's intelligence network had predicted exactly when and where the aliens would attack, and now Sarah watched the alien ships enter orbit completely unaware that they were flying into a trap. She gave the order to activate surface batteries, and immediately the farmland began to split open as enormous weapons rose from hidden silos that had been built decades ago. The alien ships barely had time to react before they were hit by withering fire from defenses they never knew existed, and within minutes 3 of their cruisers were destroyed, and the rest were retreating in confusion while transmitting urgent messages back to their command, asking how the intelligence about this colony could have been so completely wrong. Sarah felt satisfaction watching them flee because she knew that similar scenes were playing out across dozens of human colonies throughout the galaxy, and the aliens were discovering that humanity had turned every settlement into a potential fortress. Back on Earth, Dr. Helen Mitchell's communication breakthrough allowed Admiral Patricia Morgan to coordinate humanity's response across the entire galaxy with perfect timing, and while the Velcrin fleet was being destroyed in Earth's solar system, human forces were striking at alien military bases and supply depots light years away. The aliens had always controlled the galaxy through a network of strategic positions that allowed them to project power across vast distances, but humanity had spent centuries mapping these positions and identifying vulnerabilities, and now human strike teams were hitting them all simultaneously in a coordinated assault that the aliens couldn't possibly defend against. Captain Derek Hayes studied the tactical displays showing the dozens of engagements happening across known space, and he reported to Admiral Patricia that the aliens were in complete disarray because their communication systems were too slow to coordinate an effective response. By the time an alien commander in one sector learned about an attack in another sector, the battle was already over, and human forces had withdrawn, leaving destruction behind. Patricia nodded and thought about how the aliens had become dependent on their old technology and their old ways of doing things while humanity had been innovating and adapting and finding better solutions to every problem. Commander Zekthorn sat in his command chair aboard his damaged flagship and finally accepted the reality of his situation, which was that he had led his fleet to destruction because he had underestimated humanity. The proud Velcrin had believed that their crystalline ships and powerful weapons would crush human resistance within hours, but instead his fleet had been trapped and destroyed, and now he was sending out surrender signals hoping that the humans would show mercy. Around him his bridge crew worked quietly, and the confidence they had shown at the beginning of the battle was gone, replaced by fear and shock at how quickly everything had fallen apart. General Nathan Price received the surrender transmission, and he considered ignoring it because the Velcrin had come to Earth with the intention of subjugation and slavery, but Patricia Morgan ordered him to accept the surrender because humanity's goal wasn't genocide, but rather a demonstration of strength. Nathan acknowledged the order and sent instructions to the Velcrin fleet, telling them to power down their weapons and engines and await further instructions, and he watched as the surviving alien ships complied, knowing that they had no other choice. Lieutenant Amy Cooper and her husband Greg continued monitoring the situation from the Whisper, and they watched as the last of the Velcrin resistance crumbled and the alien fleet accepted defeat. Greg commented that the battle had lasted only 3 days, but had completely changed the balance of power in the galaxy, and Amy agreed while thinking about how her children would grow up in a different universe than the one she had known. The old order where aliens controlled everything and humanity bowed to their authority was finished, and what would replace it was still unclear. But at least now, humanity would have a voice in deciding the future. In the alien council chamber, Kyle Harrison stood once again at the center podium, but this time he wasn't alone because behind him were representatives of a dozen alien species who had secretly allied with humanity over the centuries. These were species who had grown tired of the Galactic Alliance's rigid hierarchy and corruption, and who had seen in humanity a chance for real change in how the galaxy was governed. Kyle looked up at the assembled ambassadors, and many of them looked away, unable to meet his gaze because they knew they had been deceived and outmaneuvered. Kyle spoke, and his voice was calm but firm, as he explained that humanity had never been the weak species the aliens assumed them to be, and that every piece of intelligence the Galactic Alliance had gathered about human capabilities had been carefully managed to create a false picture. He told them that humanity had allowed the aliens to believe they were grateful for protection, when in reality, humans had been studying their protectors and learning everything they could about alien technology and tactics and psychology. The truce that the aliens thought was their gift to humanity had actually been humanity's greatest strategic advantage, because it gave them time to prepare without the aliens realizing what was happening. The Velcrin ambassador who had declared war so confidently just days ago now sat slumped in his seat and asked in a quiet voice how humanity had managed such a massive deception across 2,000 years. Kyle explained that it had required patience and discipline and a willingness to think in terms of centuries rather than years, and that every generation of humans had understood their role in the long-term plan. Children had been raised knowing that they were part of something bigger than themselves, and that their sacrifices and their secrecy would benefit future generations who would live in a galaxy where humanity was respected rather than tolerated. One of the alien ambassadors from a species called the Draxon asked what humanity wanted now that they had demonstrated their military superiority, and Kyle's answer was simple. Humanity wanted equality and a voice in galactic affairs, and an end to the patronizing attitude that had characterized alien treatment of humans for 2,000 years. He said that humanity wasn't interested in conquest or domination, but that they would never again accept being treated as inferior or as children who needed protection from the supposedly wiser elder species. Admiral Patricia Morgan watched Kyle's speech from Earth Command, and she felt proud of how far humanity had come since that first terrifying contact with alien life 2,000 years ago. She thought about all the humans who had worked in secret building the ships and weapons and infrastructure that made this moment possible, and she wished they could all be here to see the results of their labor. Captain Derek Hayes stood beside her and commented that the galaxy would never be the same, and Patricia agreed because the old assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmic order had been shattered forever. Dr. Helen Mitchell received reports from human positions across the galaxy, confirming that all objectives had been achieved, and that alien forces were retreating or surrendering everywhere. She allowed herself to feel relief because she had spent 40 years working on the communication systems that made this coordinated campaign possible, and now she could see that her work had been worth the sacrifice. Around her, the young engineers and technicians were celebrating, but Helen remained focused on her screens because she knew the military phase was ending, but the diplomatic phase was just beginning, and that would require different skills and different strategies. 3 months after the Velcrin declaration of war, the conflict was over, and the galaxy had changed forever, because humanity had proven that they were not the weak species everyone had assumed them to be in the Galactic Alliance. Faced a choice between negotiating with Earth or watching their entire power structure collapse. Admiral Patricia Morgan stood in the same council chamber where Kyle Harrison had been threatened with subjugation, and now the 47 species of the Alliance sat in uncomfortable silence as she outlined humanity's terms for a new galactic order. Patricia was tired because she had barely slept in 3 months, but her voice was strong and clear as she explained that the old system where a few powerful species controlled everything while pretending to protect weaker species was finished. She told the assembled aliens that humanity had no interest in conquest or in taking revenge for 1,000 years of condescension, but that they would never again accept being treated as junior partners who needed permission to explore or build or expand. Captain Derek Hayes stood beside Patricia, and he was broadcasting her words to every human ship and colony and station throughout the galaxy so that billions of humans could watch as their species finally stepped out from under the shadow of alien authority. Patricia continued speaking, and she explained that the truce had taught humanity many valuable lessons, including patience and the importance of thinking in terms of centuries rather than years, and most importantly that the galaxy respected strength rather than weakness. The aliens had offered protection when humanity was vulnerable, and humans had accepted it because they had no choice but that time was over, and now Earth stood as an equal power, capable of defending itself and its interests without needing anyone's permission. On Mars, General Nathan Price stood on an observation deck looking out at the Mars fleet, which was no longer hidden, but instead hung in orbit above the red planet as a symbol of humanity's true capabilities. News feeds across the galaxy were showing images of the massive human armada, and the message was clear to every species watching, which was that humanity had been holding back for 2,000 years, and this fleet was just a fraction of what they had built in secret. Nathan thought about all the years he had spent working in underground facilities building ships that nobody outside a select group of humans even knew existed, and now those ships were public and the galaxy was reacting with shock and respect, and in some cases fear. He understood that fear because humanity had demonstrated not just military power but also strategic patience and the ability to deceive an entire galaxy for 2 millennia. And that combination made them more dangerous than any species the aliens had encountered before. Dr. Helen Mitchell's faster-than-light communication network went public and began revolutionizing galactic commerce and diplomacy overnight, because suddenly messages that used to take days or weeks to travel between star systems could be sent instantaneously. Species that had hoarded technological advantages for centuries found themselves suddenly on equal footing with humanity, who had been quietly innovating while everyone else had become comfortable with the status quo. Helen received requests from dozens of alien governments asking for access to the communication technology, and she smiled because this was exactly what humanity had planned, which was to make themselves indispensable to the new galactic order. Lieutenant Amy Cooper and her husband, Greg, retired from military service after the war ended, and they accepted positions as instructors at a new academy that humanity established on Earth's moon to train the next generation of officers and pilots. Their job was to teach young humans about the strategies and tactics that had won the war, but also to instill in them the patience and discipline that had allowed humanity to prepare for 2,000 years without revealing their true strength. Amy looked at her students and saw the future of humanity in the galaxy, and she felt hopeful because these young people would grow up in a universe where humans were respected rather than tolerated. Commander Sarah Wells remained at her colony, which had transformed from a secret military base back into a farming community, but the weapons remained hidden beneath the surface as a reminder that humanity's strength lay not just in massive fleets but in every settlement throughout the galaxy. Sarah walked through fields of wheat and corn and thought about how her colony had fought off an alien attack, and how proud she was of the colonists who had maintained the secret for so long. Children played in the streets, and they didn't know that beneath their feet were weapon systems capable of destroying warships, but someday they would learn, and they would understand the sacrifices their parents had made. Kyle Harrison became Earth's first galactic ambassador under the new order, and his job was to build genuine partnerships with alien species based on mutual respect rather than the old hierarchy where some species were considered superior to others. He traveled to alien worlds and met with their leaders, and he found that some species embraced the change while others resisted, clinging to the old ways, but all of them recognized that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. Kyle worked particularly closely with the Velcrin because Commander Zekthorn had become an unlikely ally after surviving the battle for Earth and learning to respect humanity's strategic thinking and long-term planning. Zekthorn had initially been humiliated by his defeat, but over time he came to admire how humanity had played the long game, and he became an advocate for the reformed Galactic Council, helping to draft new laws that treated all species fairly regardless of their military power or technological advancement. Kyle and Zekthorn became friends, which surprised many observers, but both of them understood that the future of the galaxy depended on former enemies learning to work together. In her office overlooking the rebuilt United Earth headquarters in Geneva, Admiral Patricia Morgan reviewed the final casualty reports from the 3-month war, and she felt grateful that human losses had been minimal because humanity's preparation and superior technology had allowed them to win battles without suffering the massive casualties that characterized most galactic conflicts. Alien losses had been significant, but not catastrophic because humanity had shown restraint even while demonstrating overwhelming force, and that combination of power and mercy had earned respect across the galaxy. Bearer Lisa Grant entered Patricia's office with the day's intelligence briefing, and she reported that all 47 Alliance species had ratified the new Galactic Charter, which officially dissolved the old hierarchy and created a more democratic system where every species had a voice. Patricia nodded and asked about the species who had voted against the charter, and Lisa explained that even though some aliens weren't happy about the changes, they were cooperating because the economic benefits of humanity's new technologies were too valuable to ignore. Through the window, Patricia could see Earth's orbital ring, which had transformed from a hidden military installation into a bustling hub of commerce and diplomacy, where human and alien ships docked side by side, exchanging goods and ideas and cultural elements in a way that the old Truce had never allowed. She thought about how far humanity had come from that terrifying first contact 2,000 years ago when Earth had nearly been destroyed, and how the species had used the time they were given to ensure they would never be that vulnerable again. Lieutenant Jake Morris flew patrol missions above the orbital ring, and his fighter squadron now served as peacekeepers rather than warriors, protecting the merchants and diplomats who traveled between Earth and other worlds. The neural interfaces that the old Alliance had banned were now standard equipment, and several alien species had requested access to the technology because they recognized its military and civilian applications. Jake enjoyed his new role because it allowed him to interact with aliens in peaceful circumstances, and he discovered that many of them were curious about humanity and wanted to learn from the species that had managed to deceive an entire galaxy. The truth about the 2,000-year truce would be debated by historians for generations, and there were many different interpretations of what had happened and why. Some saw it as humanity's greatest deception and a masterful long game played across centuries, while others viewed it as necessary preparation by a young species learning to survive in a dangerous galaxy. A few aliens even argued that the older species had known all along what humanity was doing, and that the truce had been their way of allowing humans time to mature into a power that could help reform the corrupt galactic order. Admiral Patricia Morgan didn't care much about how history would judge humanity's actions because she knew that her species had done what was necessary to survive and thrive, and she was proud of every human who had contributed to the effort across 2,000 years. As she prepared to retire after decades of service, she recorded a final message for future generations explaining that strength wasn't just about weapons or ships or technology, but about patience and vision and understanding, that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to prepare so thoroughly that when the fight finally came, the outcome was never in doubt.